All right, guys, today we're going to be looking at the golf swing at Dustin Johnson. This is arguably one of the best swings on the PGA Tour. And I think his career earnings and win total kind of speaks for that. It's a very efficient move. So, right out of the get-go, he really does a great job of maximizing what his body can do. And there are a lot of things that he does that we can learn from in terms of moving a lot more efficiently. So, one thing to note is obviously he's a freak athlete, and he's got tremendous mobility. I don't think many people out there will exactly be able to replicate the same positions as Dustin, but I think there are principles in his swing present that if you understand how to kind of look at it and dissect it, they can be applied to your own swing. So let's look at those principles. So right out of the get-go, if we look at his shoulders at address, there's a lot more tilt than you would see on average. Okay, so and I like where he has it because this respects the principle that his right hand is lower than the left. So like I said, the fact that your right hand is lower than the left, naturally it would make sense to have a little bit of tilt to the shoulders, which will predispose the spine to a little bit of a right lateral bend. This does help in terms of hitting up on the ball or creating angle of attack. His feet, you see his feet, he has about, 45 degrees of flourish, somewhere in there. The point is, he has foot flare, which adds range of motion for his pelvis to turn more. So if you guys out there have mobility issues or you are aging, it might be a good idea to add some flare to create more range of motion to turn through. Down the line, you see the knees flex over the balls of the feet. That tells us that the pressure is more forward, maybe around the balls of the feet, give or take. And when that happens, you see his scapula is nice and relaxed. It's hanging in protraction. It's rounded forward. Okay, you can see how it's more rounded forward on that front side, the anterior side of the shoulder, which allows the humerus to hang pretty natural with gravity. Okay, and typically, if that humerus is hanging naturally, it will achieve roughly a 90-degree angle. Kind of what we see there. This will create a certain distance. Okay, if you get those two principles right, from your hands to your torso. And that space is very important because our body needs space to move through, especially if we're trying to rotate. So people get too bunched up or too close to the ball will have some issues. We'll typically have some issues rotating. So one thing to note, going back to the face-on view, is the tilt that we talked about allows his elbow to actually point at the target at address. So this shoulder is more an internal rotation, which could lead to a little bit more of a stronger attachment. Now, I wouldn't say his grip is crazy strong, but it definitely is. It's definitely not on the weak side. We'll say that. So obviously, Dustin is known to have one of the most close club faces at the top of the swing, and you'll kind of see as we get into his trigger that when he triggers, what happens is he's almost kind of preloading that and giving himself a head start to kind of get to that bowed wrist at the top. Okay, so that little pre-trigger along with that grip gives him a head start to getting that flexed wrist. In my opinion, it's very hard if you're just swinging the club back without that trigger to get that bowed. And doing what he does kind of, like I said, give him a head start on that. Now, when we look at his body and kind of what it does that makes it so good, I'm going to draw some lines here to represent his mass and how well it stays balanced throughout the swing. So down on the line, you can kind of see the lines I'm drawing. This is typically how I measure swings, given that the camera is mounted and stationary. Obviously, if it's video's moving around, this would really not serve its purpose. So obviously, we kind of talked about that little trigger he has. From the face-on view, you see that when he does that, okay, he's actually starting to kind of shift his pressure very early to the right. And when that's happening, his head is actually loading ever so slightly up and to the right. Okay, now it's happening very early, so it's going up and to the right. And really, as I click back, you see his handle location, or his hands not really moving. Okay, so this is a form of creating momentum. So he's shifting the pressure right. Arms aren't really swinging back. Along with the right, it's going slightly up. Okay, that slightly up motion creates path for this club head to be thrown back. Okay, so typically, if you see people lowering into the backswing, it will create some type of obstruction with the ground and cause them to do something to kind of get that club out of the ground. Now, as we kind of get this down the line going, along with that, you start to see him actually pulling away from the wall, okay, or whatever you want to call that, the front line in front of his head. So he's going up and to the right, as well as pulling back and away, okay? This is a form of extension, and what's kind of cool about this is when you do this, you see his left, and actually you don't see it as much in this one, but there are swings out there where his left ball of his feet actually gets elevated. But like I said, this is kind of one way of creating momentum. It's getting into the motion of the swing. You see this a lot with very dynamic movers, especially long drive guys. Obviously, they do it on a bigger scale. But if you break it down and you look at something like what a Kyle Berkshire does versus what a Dustin Johnson does, principally this everything's fairly similar. Okay, it's just on a smaller scale. Obviously, Dustin's not trying to create a maximum speed pattern here. Okay, so he goes up and to the right, shifts his pressure to the right, and then what happens is you'll notice that his trunk hasn't really started rotating much, okay, until about waist high. So it is moving, but it's not moving crazy amount. You can kind of see that, oops, went too far on both of these, and I do apologize ahead of time. These videos are sensitive, but you can kind of see that from a sequencing standpoint, he is rotating, but he's not cranking his pelvis right out of the gate. It's a very sequenced rotation, okay? You see, at this point, you don't see space between his legs, which a lot of times happens when people get over-rotated too early. But like I said, I don't want to distort the message. He is rotating. It's just a very gradual, and I would say probably being wound up more through here, which is allowing that to happen, than just the pelvis. So he's understanding how to kind of use his obliques and core to kind of do this. Now, this is where you start to see his right hip move back and behind him, which creates space in that line at the top. Okay, so those of you who are familiar with my teachings know that I do a little bit of a two-step drill where you go to waist high and then you wind up, and what we're looking for is we're looking to turn our trunk to create this same thing. Okay, so right hip has moved back into internal rotation. Along with that, you see the pelvis getting rotated, which allows that trail leg to move into extension, so it's a lot straighter at the top. Like I said, these are all principles that allow him to maximize what his pivot's doing, maximize his range of motion. So he's not trying to hold flex in that right leg. He's basically turning his body and allowing the body to react to that. Okay. Now, what you'll notice is, remember, he went slightly up and to the right at the start of the swing, but as he's pivoting and gaining depth with his pelvis, his trunk is actually starting to lower. Okay, so you can look at the height of his head at the top. It's actually gotten lower, and what this is doing is it's starting to initiate the transition and the lowering. Okay, so a lot of times I see people trying to go to the top and then lowering in the downswing, and in my opinion, that's too late. Okay, so just like his pelvis is recentering from the face-on view, okay, his body is actually starting to go down. And what that's starting to do is that's starting to get the pressure and momentum kind of moving slowly in the direction of the target as well as down, which applies force to the ground. So this is where, in my opinion, this is something that I see being taught out there, and you see it being taught very manually. So, for example, getting to the top and then trying to lower, trying to squat. And when you look at the best movers in the world, they're kind of doing it within the motion, and they're not. A lot of times, it's happening a lot earlier than people think, and they're using their body to almost get a head start on those movements ahead of time. So it's all in the efficiency of how they're actually winding their body that allows them to do that. One other note on this: when you look at his takeaway, okay. His arms, okay, so when he gets his trigger, we'll get these lines out of the way. When he initiates his trigger, what happens is his lead shoulder actually starts to move into a little bit of flexion this way, okay? So it's moving into flexion, and what this does is it keeps his arms more in front of him as he goes back, okay? So he goes back, he turns, creates a big range of motion. His body, those lines we had up from the down the line view, his body is perfectly balanced now, okay? Which is really what we're looking for. Obviously lowered. And now as we get to the transition, this is where the magic happens, in my opinion. So one of the things you'll see is the lead arm relationship to the torso. As he starts to kind of clear out of the way, doesn't really change much, okay? So the lead shoulder is adducting across his chest as he turns his trunk, okay? Now, this is a byproduct of, tremendous rotation, getting the body out of the way and allowing that arm to react. And when that happens, that shaft will typically shallow because of that. And like I said, getting that sequence correct where he gets his body to kind of move first and the upper part of the motion tends to trail, it allows his knees via the pelvis and the midsection to get pretty significantly out ahead of everything. So this is where at P5, left arm parallel, I'm looking at knees to kind of go, okay, well, if I can see left knee, I know that body's not rotating. He's obviously sequenced it very well, gotten his body out of the way, and because of that, it allows his upper extremities to trail that motion from a sequencing standpoint. And as a byproduct now, you can see that body is extremely open. Now, look at that lead arm to chest relationship. Okay, so if we draw a line down the humerus, you can see that it really hasn't changed much. And I don't have degrees on that, but it hasn't really changed much. So the arm is loading across the chest, and then this is where he starts to kind of kick everything into extension. So at P5, and what's important to notice is he's not standing up when he's doing this. So his legs are moving into extension, but you don't see him really just standing up. Okay, so at this point you see his lead leg has been unweighted. It's in full extension. You actually can see space under his lead foot, which is telling us that the lead foot has no weight under it, so it's completely unweighted. Typically, very powerful players have what's called a power Z trace, which at this point the pressure would be more under the right foot, believe it or not, and the lead foot would actually be weightless, which allows that foot to fly and create some movement. And then from the down the line view, you see, because of that, obviously body getting out ahead of it, the right elbow is going to be a lot more flexed now with a very, very open trunk, okay? Now, take note that at this point, his lead arm has started to fire off the chest, okay? So it's not staying glued down the whole time. This is in part to the vertical extension process, okay? And because he kind of got that sequencing and everything correct, it creates a very stable release pattern, which is very good for consistency components. And then pretty much at the end, he just catches himself on the lead foot and then, continues to kind of unwind and eventually decelerates the club at the end. So really good swing. If you guys have any questions on this, feel free to send them over. You can utilize the contact form on my website, joshkatchgolf.com, or send an email to me, and I'd be happy to reply. Other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this, and see you soon.